Okay, well, people will be continuing to file in, but it is my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. We're delighted to host you for this evening's program and to come together to hopefully expand our capacities for thought and ethical action. Tonight's event is titled Only Connect: Friendship, Suffering, and Character. I'm going to talk briefly about the structure of our time together and how we're going to be proceeding. I get to introduce our distinguished speaker, President L. Gregory Jones. He will speak for a good portion of the time, and then we're going to open it up for audience engagement through the Q&A function. At particular times during the lecture, you'll see some activity in the chat, and these are all communications coming from the Psychological Humanities and Ethics team here at the Lynch School of Education and Human Development at BC, so you can be on the lookout for those. But let's turn our attention first to what we're wanting to be doing here tonight. I recall a moment in graduate school when a well-known psychiatrist came to speak about psychopathology and various treatment modalities. It was a good but typical address. Then afterwards, a small group of students had the opportunity to sit with the speaker, with the psychiatrist, in a salon. And someone asked him about his treatment approach, and particularly as it related to what he most frequently prescribes to people. I'll never forget his response. He shared with us the most common medications. That's how he started, Prozac, this and that. Then he halted and he asked, do you want to know what I wish I could write on my prescription pad for almost every one of my patients? We all leaned in. Meaningful friendships and community. He elaborated the ways in which isolation, distance, separation, and loneliness were all around him. And he believed that friendship might actually be a remedy, if only it was valued, lived, and prioritized in real ways culturally. More than anything else, he knew his patients were living without an element as critical as oxygen: loving community. I must say that I too often wonder about the interventions born from a highly individualistic paradigm. I question my place in the systems that perpetuate this as a psychotherapist. Furthermore, I see the very real effects of relational anemia with my patients, and I wish relationship was available to them as a place where they could live and grow and struggle. But alas, I often send them back into the world with myself as the main 50-minute space of authenticity in an otherwise atomized set of realities. One of the hopes of this lecture series is to think together about questions such as these, about loneliness, the individual subject, friendship, community, but to do so with the wealth of the types of formulations that come from psychology, philosophy, and theology. And the truth is, loneliness, disconnection, and alienation are amply talked about in each of these three disciplines. President Jones swims in these spaces, and I'm quite excited that he will be inviting us on a journey through these sets of topics tonight. So let me introduce President Jones to you in a more formal way. L. Gregory Jones was just recently inaugurated, just 8 months in, as the president of Belmont University. Prior to that, he was the longtime dean of the Duke Divinity School and held a variety of roles there, including vice president and vice provost for global strategy and programs. He was also the provost and executive vice president of Baylor University. Alongside of his administrative work, President Jones is deeply respected as a theologian whose work centers on the nature of forgiveness, the significance of Christian ministry and pastoral leadership, and social innovation and entrepreneurship. He's a prolific and beloved author, having written over 200 essays and articles, and authoring or editing 19, maybe it's even 20 books. I didn't see what happened in the last month. And 2 of them are Navigating the Future and Embodying Forgiveness. These are 2 separate texts, and just 2 of them that I'll name, very well known. On a more personal note, I've known about President Jones for some time, but hadn't actually heard him speak until I was at a Jubilee Center event in Oxford just a few years back. He gave the keynote and absolutely blew my mind. The territories he traversed were mind-boggling in all the best of ways. I was amazed. And then I learned the next day that he was in bed because he had a terrible flu or something like that. And I came to find out that he was horribly sick even during the time of the lecture. I couldn't even believe my ears. He had pulled off a talk like that while violently ill, and that made no sense to me. You can just ask my wife. I'm in a fetal position at the very beginning of a sniffle. So it really told me something about how this guy is built. But all joking aside, over the years, President Jones has been quite kind and generous to me, and I feel honored that he's joining us here tonight in this way. He's one of those interdisciplinary thinkers who makes it feel effortless and yet maintains a depth of engagement that calls us to an imperative quite critical for how we are to live our lives. So with no further ado, I turn it over to you, President Jones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. It's a great joy to be with you all this evening and to have this opportunity to gather. I wish it was in person, but delighted that we could do this via Zoom, and have great admiration, David, for the work you do at Boston College through the Lynch School and this initiative on bringing together different disciplines, psychological ethics and the humanities, which I think is so important. And the way in which you framed the opening introduction, I thought was just brilliant and insightful in terms of those themes around friendship and community. And that's what I want to reflect on tonight. So it's a great joy to be with you, even via Zoom. We all know that we've been in a pandemic. That's what's occasioning the Zoom reality. But I want to talk first about multiple pandemics that we've been experiencing over the last couple of years, because it points to the multiple dimensions of the realities we're struggling with. I'm mindful that even this evening, we're now burdened by the reality of the outbreak of a war with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which only kind of piles on or adds to the sense of being in a reactive mode that the multiple pandemics we've been facing over the last couple of years have really highlighted. When I say multiple pandemics, I mean obviously COVID-19 and all of the challenges that the lockdown and varying protocols have presented for all of us. And yet it was also heightened attention to racial injustice with Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and especially George Floyd's murder. And then if you add in the economic disruptions that the pandemic has caused, the political polarization that we're experiencing, and also challenges to mental health. I think that those, particularly for young adults as well as older adults, have been intensified by the kind of isolation that we have been experiencing. So we've been dealing with multiple pandemics over the last 2 years that have just amplified the realities of suffering and the sense of isolation. And yet, if we take a step back, we'd actually realize that none of this is actually only 2 years old. Maybe the virus itself, but there have been sicknesses and other kinds of conditions that have caused that kind of suffering. And when we think about the deeper issues of loneliness and isolation and depression and anxiety, systemic suffering from racism, poverty, other kinds of economic disruptions, joblessness, homelessness, they all intersect in ways that make it challenging for us to find any sense of hope for the future. We feel this acute sense of being in a reactive mode as a result of human sin, human suffering. And so we struggle with those realities. Take, for example, the sense that David was talking about in terms of loneliness and isolation, depression, and anxiety. Prior to the launch of the pandemic, statistics for 18 to 22-year-olds on college campuses already had significant increases in loneliness, isolation, anxiety, depression, suicide ideation. Some of the charts you'd see charting the increases in all of those indicators, the only reason they didn't look like a ski slope was how the x-axis and the y-axis had been drawn, so that it showed steady increases, but not quite as steep as it might otherwise have shown. These kinds of realities have been present to us. The larger issues of racism and poverty have become so real to so many people. Toni Morrison's extraordinary novel, Beloved, goes back to the 19th century to a freed woman, Sethi, who struggles, even as she's been freed from slavery, by the horrors of what she had experienced and endured, as well as the realities of killing her own child in order to try to avoid being taken back into slavery when men come after her. The narrator describes Sethi's reality as saying, "It was never too early to start the day's work of beating back the past." It's that haunting reality, which often of whether the suffering continues or whether it has stopped, it begins to haunt our memories, our psychological well-being, our ability to relate to one another. And one of the effects of that kind of intense suffering is that it tends to shrink us, to further isolate us. As David was talking about that lack of community, it often is the intense experience of suffering that further isolates us and intensifies the experience of that separation and that loneliness. It may be that that suffering was already manifested in a lack of friendships and communities, but often suffering, like sickness itself, isolates us and undermines the capacity for relationships of friendship. There are multiple reasons why these realities underlie our time as late modern Americans, Westerners more generally. It has to do with an individualistic ethos, as David was suggesting. It has to do with a certain kind of consumer mindset that has impoverished our sense of what human nature is fully about, who we are as created beings made in the image and likeness of God, as Jews and Christians and Muslims would all identify ourselves. It's also been intensified by the emergence of forms of social media and certain kinds of uses of technology, which, as Sherry Turkle in her book called Alone Together, where we have become perhaps more technologically savvy, but at the cost of moral richness in our life. And yet there's also another dimension that affects us, and that is even our understanding of ethics has become too individualized and focused on decision-making. And we've lost some of the larger horizons that go back to Plato and Aristotle and have then migrated their way through Jewish and Christian and Muslim traditions of ethical inquiry. At the heart of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics are two books focused on friendship and the moral life. I remember it wasn't until I was in graduate school that I actually read Aristotle's Ethics, and I thought somehow I'd been cheated out of some rich understanding of life by the lack of attention to friendship. I'd taken ethics courses in college, but they were more lifeboat ethics kinds of approaches and decisionist kinds of approaches, where the choice was, were you going to be a consequentialist and focus on the greatest good for the greatest number, or were you going to be a deontologist and focus on rules and principles? There wasn't attention to that larger context of character and especially of friendship. And so perhaps our difficulty in knowing how to deal with suffering is connected to our inability to have a rich understanding of human nature and what it means for human beings to flourish. My phrase, the title phrase for my lecture tonight, comes from Ian Forster, the great novelist's famous comment, only connect. Two simple words, and yet the profundity of that injunction is extraordinarily important, especially for our time, especially as a way to deal with the realities of our multiple pandemics, as well as those underlying issues that we're trying to wrestle with. I began to realize the connections of suffering and friendship and character in a new way when I came across a book that came out shortly before the pandemic by Johann Hari, a British journalist. The book is entitled Lost Connections. Lost Connections. And what he's pointing to in the book is the underlying realities that now have often been treated by pharmaceuticals, antidepressants, and things like that. His subtitle is Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. The presenting issue for Hari himself was that he's been on antidepressants since he had was 12 years old. And he was getting into his late 20s and early 30s. And he was realizing that the pharmaceuticals, the antidepressants, weren't really helping. Part of the book is an analysis of what he perceived as the pharmaceutical industry overselling the effect of antidepressants. But what really haunted him was a worry that those pharmaceuticals were treating symptoms and not dealing with the underlying causes of at least what he was experiencing in terms of depression and loneliness and anxiety. As he begins to explore his own life and those deeper connections and his journey, what he began to realize was that we have lost connections. He describes those lost connections in multiple ways. It's lost connections to meaningful work, lost connections to meaningful relationships, lost connections to meaningful values and ethics, lost connections to childhood trauma, lost connections to the natural world, lost connections, he notes, to any hopeful sense of the future. All of those lost connections reflect the deeper and underlying reality that manifest themselves in a variety of psychological conditions, and sometimes desperate ways to try to address those conditions. What he proposes is a journey to try to find ways to reconnect. What David was talking about in his introduction of those friendships and community. Indeed, he actually talks about going to visit a mental health clinic in London where there were two different paths in the psychiatrist's office. One was to be treated in a traditional model. The other was actually to become a part of a community garden. And no surprise, what he discovers is the people who decide to participate in the community garden often became healthier than those who took the traditional path, because that community garden gave them meaningful work, the meaningful values, the meaningful relationships, that sense of caring and tending for something that moved them toward the future. Now, let me be clear. I'm not meaning to suggest that all issues of being unhealthy psychologically, spiritually, emotionally are the cause of are reflective of this sense of loneliness or isolation. There are some that are clearly chemically and biologically related, and they're very concrete physical and physiological causes of all of that. The point is that we've conflated it all, and because we haven't been paying attention to the relationships between friendship, the formation of character, and how you bear suffering, that we have tended to conflate it all into a medicalized and often pharmaceuticalized approach to the issue, rather than dealing with those underlying causes, those lost connections, as Hari talks about. What we're really searching for in that sense is a way to connect to those meaningful relationships, values, work, the natural world, to a sense of hope for the future. In that sense, the deeper predicament that we're wrestling with, I want to suggest, is the reality of the loss of transcendence, the loss of a sense that there is something, someone, some reality beyond this world that gives meaning and purpose to that world. The reality that we're wrestling with is there actually a purpose to the world in which we live, or is it a nightmare of absurd unmeaning? The kind of existentialist crisis of the middle decades of the 20th century, particularly coming out of the Holocaust and World War II. Is the world a nightmare of absurd unmeaning, and the best you can do is to try to create it? Or is there some kind of transcendent story, transcendent goodness that can draw us out of ourselves and renew that sense of hope for the future? That's the deepest sense of the lost connection that I think Hari is pointing to, and those communities and those friendships that can sustain meaningful sense of relationship and purpose, even in the midst of intense suffering. I take a brief detour into the kind of the history of modernity, particularly as it's been articulated by the philosopher Charles Taylor in his book, A Secular Age. It's a magisterial work, not particularly easy reading. I'd suggest instead James K.A. Smith's short summary of Taylor's book, a book called How Not to Be Secular. What Taylor argues, as James Smith summarizes it, is at the beginning of modernity, you wouldn't find atheists much. What you'd find are people who everybody assumed in those days, in the early days of modernity, everybody assumed there was a God. The question was God active in the world or not? So that if you found people who didn't believe in God much or didn't think God was active, they were called deists, that there was a God, but that God had set the world into motion like clockwork and was removed from the world. And so at the beginning of modernity, everybody believed in God. The only question was whether or how God was active in the world. Taylor suggests at the end of modernity, the time when we live, the consensus seems to be that there is no God. Taylor says hauntingly, even the people who are religious, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, others, seem to live and act as if there's no God. And so the assumption of our world is that we live in an immanent frame, that this world is all there is. It's a haunting kind of challenge to suggest that we all live in the immanent frame. Dorothy Day used to say that she wanted to live in a way that wouldn't make sense if God doesn't exist. She founded the Catholic worker movement and had this extraordinary social witness and ministry. The harsh reality that haunts me is too often my life makes way too much sense, regardless of whether God exists or not. And yet there is this sense that if there is a God, it ought to shape our friendship, our community, our ways of engaging one another. Indeed, even the issues we're dealing with over the last 24 hours, 48 hours, and last several weeks about Russia's invasion of Ukraine is because of a crisis in meaning and purpose more globally. Amanda Ripley, in a recent book called High Conflict, looks at these issues both at a large scale level and at the local level. And what she says is that absent a compelling story, people tend to degenerate into violence and bitterness and division. Now, again, violence has existed as long as there have been human beings, going back to Cain and Abel. But the point is, it tends to degenerate and become more pervasive, more frequent, more destructive when there's an absence of a compelling story. Ripley distinguishes between what she calls high conflict and good conflict. Because high conflict, all you care about is that your opponent or your enemy, your rival, loses, even if it costs you. Whereas in good conflict, you're focused on the goods of a larger purpose, and you're discerning together what's the best solution. It's not to suggest that everybody's going to be sitting around singing Kumbaya. It may actually lead to vigorous disagreement. But as the great Jesuit scholar John Courtney Murray used to say in the middle decades of the 20th century, he longed for meaningful disagreements. That's good conflict. That's different than destructive conflict, what Ripley calls high conflict. And so you see the crisis, the deepest crisis that Hari is pointing to, these lost connections, is really ultimately a lost connection to a compelling story, a story that begins with creation and ends with a vision of wholeness, what Christians would call new creation, what Jews might call shalom. It's a vision of a beginning and an end that is peaceful and loving, and a compelling story in which we find ourselves as participants in that larger story that sometimes calls us out of ourselves and into new relationships. But when you think about suffering, the crisis that we tend to experience is a shrinking of the world. Whether that's because the suffering is so intense that we just want it to end no matter what. Elaine Scarry, in her book, The Body in Pain, an extraordinary book, talks about how people, when they're doing torture, will try to concentrate pain so powerfully in a place where you will betray anyone and anything because you just want the suffering to stop. And that intensity means you no longer believe in a larger story. All you want to do is stop the pain. That's the haunting of the memories that Sethi suffers from in Beloved. And you begin to feel that there is no compelling story. That was the crisis of some of the people who suffered, like Primo Levi in the Holocaust. Even after they survived, they couldn't find any reason or purpose, unlike somebody like Viktor Frankl, who began to discover that compelling story and that, in spite of it all, saying yes in a powerful way. Or put it in the context of Beloved. Sethi, the same woman who struggled so profoundly, was sometimes at a point of wondering whether there was anything that held together. At the end of the book, Paul D., another freed slave who had what the narrator says, a tobacco tin in his chest where his heart used to be, its lid rusted shut. Paul D. says to Sethi, Sethi, me and you, we got more yesterday than anybody. What we need is some kind of tomorrow. Well, the compelling story for Jews, Christians, Muslims is that there is some kind of tomorrow because it's rooted in who God is. And it's that sense that begins to give you that orientation for the future. When you think about Beloved, it's a powerful novel, haunting in its attention to the realities of suffering on a social scale, on a psychological scale in a person's life. What's often not noted about that book is its epigraph. The epigraph is actually from Paul's letter to the church at Rome in Romans 9-11. And it's actually a citation within Romans 9-11 to Hosea. The epigraph is, those who are not my people, I will call my people. Those who are not beloved, I will call beloved. It suggests that the compelling story isn't one that trivializes suffering. It's one that acknowledges the haunting realities of suffering. And yet, through human connection, through community, through the people Israel, and the new Israel, as Paul calls it, the church, there is a community that can acknowledge and embrace the reality of brokenness and suffering and carry people through it because of that connection. The connection that is deeper than just a chosen voluntary association, a connection that Aristotle would characterize as friendship, and for Thomas Aquinas would characterize it as the heart of the moral life. Aristotle thought that friendship with the gods was the one thing you couldn't aspire to, and so the highest commitment of friendship was character friendship. Thomas Aquinas turns that on its head and says friendship with God is at the heart of the moral life because of who God is in Jesus Christ. There is a friendship, as Jesus says in John's gospel, no longer do I call you servants, I call you friends. And that friendship with God is at the heart of the moral life. Thomas Aquinas says two things. He says, first, charity is a form of friendship with God. And then he said, charity is the form of the virtues. So that if you want to become a virtuous person, Aquinas would suggest, you need to be on a journey of ever-growing intimacy with God. Well, what does that look like? And how does that shape character? And how does that help us deal with the reality of suffering, of brokenness? Whether it's on a large-scale reality, or whether it's just the kind of personal loneliness, anxiety, depression, sense of shame, all the things that can undermine our capacity to feel connected. Dorotheus of Gazia, the 6th century monk, has a beautiful image for this. Dorotheus of Gazia suggests that God is at the center of a circle. All of humanity is on the circumference of the circle. And so what Dorotheus of Gaza suggests is, if you want to get closer to God, you will invariably be drawing closer to other human beings. And if you draw closer to other human beings, you will invariably draw closer to God. As you drift farther away from God, you drift farther away from human beings. And if you drift farther away from other human beings, you drift farther away from God. It suggests that integral connection, that commitment to seeing one another as human beings, fragile human beings, capable of great grace and great gifts. As Psalm 8 suggests, human beings created just a little lower than the angels, and yet also capable of great destruction and fallibility, who shall return to dust and ashes. It's that recognition of the royal dignity of what it means to be human, and also the fragility, the vulnerability of what it means to be human that draws us together. And so it's in that commitment to friendship, not in a Facebook style way or a trivial way in which we count somebody as a friend if we've gotten to spend 10 minutes with them, or we've checked out a box on an app, but rather the kind of journeying together where we begin to learn how to embrace, to create a holding environment in the midst of that suffering. What Hari talks about as those lost connections, he actually draws on analogy to grief, because grief isolates, marginalizes, causes a sense of closing in on oneself. And what's needed is someone, a friend, to embrace. When my father died quite unexpectedly, now almost 40 years ago, my mom was devastated, as was I, as was my brother and sister. And there were numbers of people who would just say, well, if you need anything, call. What I realized was we were least able to reach out because we felt so broken. What we needed, and the people who were most valuable, were those friends who would call and say, hey, I'm coming over to take you for ice cream. I'll be there in 10 minutes. And you had to actively object, or else you were going to be drawn out. There were times I'd think, I don't really want to be with anybody. I don't feel like ice cream. And yet it was those friends creating that holding environment, an environment where we became capable of listening and learning and engaging. That sense of friendship and commitment is about forming character. It's about cultivating the virtues that we depend on. It's about that sense of perseverance, of love, of grace, of generosity, of seeing those intrinsic connections working together in a community garden, or as Greg Boyle has shown in his work with Homeboy Industries, engaging people in an innovative future that help heal the wounds of the past. David mentioned that I've done a lot of work around forgiveness, and some of that has also engaged issues in the reality of trauma, and psychology has done so much to show the pervasive and long-lasting effects of trauma and how we begin to acknowledge the realities of that. And yet what I thought was we had to find ways to forgive and heal the wounds of the past so that we could envision a new life in the future. What I learned through Greg Boyle and through talking to victims and survivors of the genocide in Rwanda and in Burundi, and spending time with the Amish community after the nickel mine school shooting, was that often it was the reality and the power of friendship. Both that which preceded the suffering, carried through the suffering, and new friendships that emerged out of the suffering, that created a new future that enabled healing of the past, a healing of those wounds in powerful ways. And so what we begin to see is once friendship becomes part of our natural vocabulary and exploring the moral complexity and richness and depth of it, we begin to discover the power of those relationships in a broader community to sustain us even through pain and suffering. The suffering is often unbearable if it is endured in isolation. And yet when it is shared and carried alongside by dear friends, by unlikely friends, by a larger community, it provides opportunities for healing and hope and renewal. Hari goes on his investigation in lost connections and ends up actually going to visit an Amish community in northern Indiana because he's perplexed as to why the Amish, when they are invited as late teenagers to spend a year or two living among the English, what the Amish call all those who are not Amish, folks like you and me, a high percentage of those Amish want to go back to an Amish way of life. And he's like, why are they rejecting our world to go back to that world? And the heart of what he discovers is that sense of community, that sense of connectedness, that sense of bonding. That's what forms a healthy character. It's what enables us to rise above and overcome and cope with the realities of a broken, suffering world. Sometimes the seemingly unbearable suffering that we may experience as the result of things that have been done to us, or things that have people who failed to do things for us, or things we have done or failed to do for others, or the realities of that larger kind of haunting of the realities of social brokenness, systemic oppression, and how we find paths forward into the future. The compelling story, I believe, is a story with lots of complexities of Hosea and Romans 9 to 11, twists and turns. It's not saying it's easy, but it is saying that there are signs of hope that can carry us, that the world is ultimately a place of meaning and purpose. It was created by a good and gracious God, and our destiny is with a good and gracious God. That's what enables us to bear the brokenness. The trouble we have is that because we have so isolated our disciplines in the university and settled for an impoverished understanding of what it means to be human, we have failed to recognize the richness of what it means to feel the connections of being embraced by God and embracing one another. I want to put it in a different way, in the context of only connecting and discovering these ways of bearing with suffering. I want to close with two images. One actually comes from Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. Everybody knows the story of the legend of the Grand Inquisitor and Ivan's Rebellion, because those two sections are excerpted out of the Brothers Karamazov and put in philosophy textbooks and theology textbooks. It's about, quote unquote, the problem of evil, and it's the reality of suffering. And Ivan's Rebellion is a clear-eyed view drawn actually out of Dostoevsky's own reading of the newspaper in 19th century Russia. Those examples that Ivan uses in his rebellion of Russians throwing babies up in the air and piercing them with their bayonets, those were stories Dostoevsky had read and heard about that had happened in real life. And it was the reality of the depth of human suffering and the tortures of the psychological realities of people's lives that led Ivan to say, I respectfully return my ticket, a protest atheism that was as often articulated as the reality of modernity. But because Dostoevsky wrote such a massively long book that's hard to assign to a class, I tried to do it one semester and had outright rebellion by the students, because I even gave them extra time away, and they said, that's not enough to get through 900 pages of a novel. It's hard to get through it all in any kind of short period of time. And yet the power of Dostoevsky's perspective is that Ivan ultimately goes mad in the book. He goes crazy because he tries to shoulder his protest all by himself, and he becomes disconnected. He begins to suffer those lost connections, and he can't cope, and he goes mad. Alyosha, the person to whom Ivan protests in his rebellion, is inspired by the Russian monk, Father Zosima. And Alyosha responds by becoming a person of character modeled after Father Zosima. And what you see at the end is that the most powerful response to Ivan's rebellion is that Ivan goes mad, and Alyosha, the person who becomes a friend, a person of character, indeed, in Dostoevsky's terms, a saintly person, a person marked by holiness, is the person who actually is able to bear the suffering of others in a redemptive way and to hold it together. Alyosha is the friend. Ivan is the individualist who goes mad. That's the power of that connection, that sense that love is powerful, more powerful than even the worst that human beings can do to each other, the worst that you have suffered, the worst that I have suffered, the worst that I have done, the worst that you have done. There is still love on the other side of that. A love that is manifest in friendship, in people becoming people of character, to bear that suffering in their own life and in the lives of others. Well, there's another way to put it. It's basketball season, and though I'm now a Belmont Bruin fan, it actually goes back to my time with Mike Krzyzewski, the legendary coach of Duke basketball. The story is less about things that happen on the court than happen off the court. I'd gotten to know Coach K pretty well through some shared projects we had done while I was at Duke and been involved with him. The person who hired him was a man named Tom Butters. Tom Butters was the athletic director at Duke for many years, was a pioneering leader. He helped to create what we now know as March Madness. Tom and his wife, Lynn, were friends of my wife's and mine. Tom died about 5 years ago. And Lynn, his wife, asked if I would do his memorial service. They wanted to have a private family service and then a more public service that the whole Duke community and broader friends could attend. Lynn told me that Coach K wanted to speak at the funeral. And I said, isn't he having hip surgery? And she said, yes, but he still will be there. He wants to speak. And so I said, great. We got there that day. Coach K was only about 6 days after his surgery, but he was there and wanted to be strong and be present for the service. And when he stood up to talk, I learned why. He talked about how Tom Butters had taken a risk to hire him when he was the coach at Army and had a losing record. Tom Butters was the athletic director, and he decided that Coach K was the guy for him. And he said to him, he said, you're my guy. I believe in you. I think you can come to Duke and be successful. So Coach K accepted the job. Coach K had been the coach for 4 years. When Coach K had a pretty bad year, he'd had 3 rebuilding years, but they were all struggling years. He had a losing record at Duke. During that 4th year, he lost to Wagner College of New York over the Christmas holidays when Wagner College was a Division III program. And then he lost to Ralph Sampson's Virginia in the first round of the ACC tournament by 50 points, 5-0. The next morning, the Durham Herald-Sun and the Raleigh News and Observer both said it's time for a change of coaches in Durham. Tom Butters called Mike Krzyzewski in. Coach K said he thought it was to find out he was fired. And Tom Butters said, Mike, I believe in you. You're my guy. You're my coach. Let's keep moving forward. The next year, Johnny Dawkins and Tom Amaker and Jay Billis and Mark Allery beat UNC, made it to the NCAA tournament, and within 3 more years, they were playing for the national championship. The rest of the story is history. Side note, just of interest on leadership studies, if Mike Krzyzewski had been fired at the end of that 4th year, he probably would have had a hard time getting another coaching job. He'd been a losing coach at Army, a losing coach that far into his Duke tenure. Might have been challenging, but Tom Butters said, you're my guy, you're my coach. Coach K then said in 1995, he had back troubles. He had to step away from coaching. Duke imploded that season. It was a terrible season. And he said he went to Tom Butters to try to resign. And Tom Butters said, no, you're my coach, you're my guy, I believe in you, and I'm going to keep committed to you. Coach K was moved by that, stayed on as the coach, became the winningest coach in college basketball history, a legendary molder and shaper of character, a loyal and good friend to many. As Coach K was talking and recounting these stories, he then got to the point where he was going to conclude his comments. It's the only time I've ever seen him cry. He paused, he looked down, he started to wipe tears away from his eyes, and he said, Tom Butters, at several key moments in my life, said the 4 words that are the most powerful words any human being can say to another. I believe in you. And he paused and he said, as you leave this place this day in the midst of grief and sadness about Tom's life and his death, Coach K said, go find somebody and say to them, I believe in you, because they'll change a person's life. That's what I think Forster was pointing to when he said only connect. That's what Johann Hari was searching for in Lost Connections, is that sense of saying, I believe in you. For Jews and Christians and Muslims, and for broader religious people who have a serious understanding of God and God's relationship to the world, there is this sense in which God says to the world and to each of us as human beings, I believe in you, and calls us then to believe in each other. It's Dorotheus of Gaza's journey toward the center of the circle, becoming closer to other people, saying to people who are despair, who are afraid that there is no meaning or purpose, who are isolated and anxious and depressed, people who are pondering suicide, I believe in you. That doesn't say, I agree with everything you think, or I agree with everything you've done or left undone or failed to do. It's saying, I believe in you. I'm connected to you. I'm on this journey with you. When you have that quality of friendship at the heart of relationships and at the heart of a sense of community, anything can be born. When you are lacking that sense, when you don't think anybody believes in you, that's when you're most likely to become self-destructive and despairing. What we're called to be about is only connecting, to being people of grace and love and gratitude who connect to each other, who bear with each other, and who carry with each other a journey that enables us to bear suffering and to discover what 1 Timothy 6 calls life that really is life. Not a life free of suffering, but a life in which suffering can be borne, endured, and even overcome because of that larger horizon of friendship and connection and character. Only connect, I believe in you, are phrases that we can carry with us each and every day of our lives. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, President Jones. I'm sitting with this and my mind is spinning, and there's so much to process, but that was a very beautiful calling to think of this from a very different frame than I think many people in our audience often reflect with. So I'm going to say a couple things, but that's to buy the audience some time to start typing into Q&A and throwing your questions in here. We have some time here with President Jones, and I welcome you to put your responses in, your questions, so we can hear a little bit more of what's on your minds. As I'm sitting here and thinking about the ways that you just laid out this issue, that as I started tonight by saying, like, the questions of alienation and disconnection are a prominent part of what psychologists are talking about these days. The philosophers, about, the existentialists and humanists, this is authenticity, alienation, all this has been such a big part of discourse. But I would bet a wager that it's been a long time since a lot of the people in this audience actually have thought about the question of a type of transcendent story or transcendent frame. As I heard you speak, it made me think about how prominent and if not totalizing this immanent frame is that you're talking about, such that I imagine people are thinking they just heard a sermon with all this sort of confessional assumption behind it. And this is what it is to have a theologian speak to us that can actually call us to understanding that there are different frames altogether that can be brought to these questions and for us to struggle with and think with. And I think it's just incredibly beautiful and very powerful. And that Dorothy Day quote, I'm going to butcher it, but wants to live in a way that wouldn't make sense if God didn't exist. Is that something along the lines of what you said?
Yep.
Very, very powerful and so important. So I'll go to the audience questions in a second, but one last thing I was thinking about is one of the great enigmas that I often talk with students about is this thing that is trauma and this thing that is deep suffering in life, and how for some people it functions in very much the way that you described. It can shut us down. I mean, that type of suffering can make it so that one can't get out of oneself because it is just an excruciating, when you get punched in the stomach, you don't extend your arms out, you tuck her in, right? I mean, you protect. And I've seen that so many times. I mean, I've felt that so many times. It's often a reality, but I also have seen it be the reverse, where trauma and deep suffering is the very thing that can sometimes tear someone open to allow them to face towards the outside for once and call them beyond the small story that they used to live, because it sort of initiates a different level of reality for them to see with and to suffer with others from. And what makes it so some people shut down, go inward, and other people blast open, that's the enigma. And I do wonder about how community and friendship live in relationship to that enigma, and whether it is having rich community that enables the possibility for trauma to become a gift.
Well, I think there's a lot to that. And I think, even shared practices and ways, I think within the Jewish tradition, the practice of Shabbat, and, telling a story that goes back to my father was a wandering Aramean, or on Passover, why is this night different from every other night? That actually locates you in a story, that those shared practices and just breaking bread together can be powerful in connecting. And I think that it's in that openness that actually is a search. And to say, to say that that's the larger compelling story isn't to say that it solves the problem. It actually presents it in a different light. And so, Dostoevsky doesn't give a definitive answer to Ivan. He provides an alternative way of life. And it's there where the questions become livable in a different way. And I do think that, if you think about the Diary of Anne Frank, at the end, she says, I still believe that most people are good. How the heck do you believe that after you've been, cooped up in a tiny little room and are about to be taken away, to an early, tragic, horrific death, unless there's this sense that there is something beyond the reality of the pain and suffering in the moment.
Yeah. Well, I think you speak to something that, this question from the audience might actually be something that you can keep tying in what you were just saying. It says, thank you for sharing this with us. The times we are in are causing a kind of tiredness and a source of a certain level of weariness from struggling with the realities that we face each day. We are awakening from an ongoing pandemic that's causing us a setback with mental health and new challenges and a diminished connection with others. Our support community in the church is greatly lacking at our parish level. From a point of view as a married father trying to support his family and live a Catholic Christian faith, our current culture causes more obstacles and difficulties. How can we regain our human connection and wellness in an increasing meaning challenged time?
Wow, there's a lot in that question, powerful and poignant, and I fully agree that it is challenging, both because of the realities of the world and because a lot of religious communities are dysfunctional as well. And I think part of that is in the Protestant world, there's some issues around betrayed trust, sexual abuse, those sorts of issues. That's been a reality in the Catholic world as well. I noted 20 years ago when the Catholic sexual abuse scandal first surfaced, that it felt so much more painful to people than did Enron or WorldCom or, the betrayals in secular companies, because it was kind of like, yeah, we didn't expect much there. But I think there is, particularly in religious communities and among people who are supposed to care. It's when a psychologist or a psychiatrist, psychotherapist betrays trust. There's something like a sacred bond has been broken. And I think that's true even of friendship. And part of it is, I think we've lost the ability to just care in very deep ways at a basic human level for other people. And so, there's a powerful novel by Colum McCann that came out a couple of years ago called A Paragon. It's the word a paragon is for it's a geometric figure I didn't know existed. That has it's the word a paragon is for a geometric figure with a countably infinite number of sides. And you think, well, that's extraordinary. But and the novel is set up as fragments of the history of the disputes between Israelis and Palestinians. And you realize religious, historical, political, economic, geographical, narratival, just about every dimension you can possibly, even brings in the flight and migration patterns of birds and how that's affected the history. And you're just like, oh yeah, and it feels so overwhelmingly complex. And at the heart of the story is a story of a Palestinian Muslim and an Israeli Jew, both of whom have lost daughters to the violence. And they become friends. And in the midst of this highly unlikely friendship, which costs both of them in their broader relationships, in that friendship emerges possibilities and hope in extraordinarily beautiful ways, to the point where the Palestinian Muslim goes and does a master's degree in Holocaust studies in England. The Jewish Israeli Jew learns Arabic so he can actually communicate in his friend's language and understand his friend from his own linguistic context. And there's something that is just exhilaratingly beautiful about this friendship. And that's the power, I think, of how we have to begin to repair these issues is unlikely friendships lived and deepened in ways that require patience and perseverance. I sometimes want to fix everything at once and figure out a way to bring everybody together. And then, that often just makes matters worse. And so I hear the poignancy in the question. And I'd love to be able to say, here are the 3 steps and you can solve it tomorrow. What I think we have to do is, hey, find someone with whom you're estranged, or find someone who is an unlikely person. Maybe if you're a liberal Democrat, go find a conservative Republican, or whatever the unlikely friendship for you might be, and start having a regular breakfast and just listen to each other's stories and locate those stories within a larger story of hope and grace and love.
And as someone who values sharing the table with others, the picture of breaking bread that you talked about earlier, the Shabbat table or so forth. I mean, I believe we cannot underestimate what it means to sit with one another and eat and share food and be in just the deeply carnal that is that shared human need that can be such a place of beauty as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think of the Jewish notion of tikkun olam, to repair the world, and if you save one person, you save the whole world. Well, obviously, there's some factual sense in which that's not true, and yet in some deeply metaphorical sense, it is. I'll tell you a story. I was just interviewing scholarship students last week who are high school seniors wanting to come to Belmont and for presidential scholars. And there was a young woman who was being interviewed who said her parents divorced when she was 8. One parent became homeless. The father became homeless. The mother became an alcoholic. And she got used to empty bottles on the floor as her mother would be passed out. And she said she eventually discovered through some friends that love could triumph over bitterness. And I just thought, wow, you're 17 years old. And, I was humbled. And then what she wants to study is fashion, interior design in our College of Architecture. And I said, why interior design? And she said, well, I want to help create spaces where people can feel at home. And when I heard that, I thought, out of her suffering and friends who've come alongside her, now she wants to literally create spaces where other people can find that sense of community and that sense of relationship. And, I just thought to myself, can I become like you if I grow up ever? I just 17 years old, and there was a depth and a richness. And I think we've got to look for those small gestures that might have transformational possibilities.
Yes. Well, this next question is not an easy one at all, but I'm curious your thoughts, and that is, and you've sort of nodded to this, that you recognize this. Sometimes religious roots can be limiting too, and so the question then follows: can values exist without these roots?
Well, they obviously do. I think the question is whether they have the durability and sustainability across time. I don't think that there's any easy answers. I think it's the question of transcendence that really presses in on us. And there's plenty of reasons to disbelieve anything and to become cynical. The greater risk is to actually believe, and to stake, to stake your life on the proposition that that there is meaning and purpose in the universe. I don't, when people say I can't find a synagogue or I can't find a church, sometimes I'm cynical about that and say, well, it's because you're expecting too much. But I'm also deeply sympathetic because there's a lot of dysfunction and paralysis. And the question is there a holding environment? I have a friend who's a pastor of a congregation. He told me his last new member class, he said, I had a CEO of a Fortune 500 company and a homeless person, a person who I think is a fundamentalist, and a person who I think is at best an agnostic. And I thought, oh, now there's a community that would have really interesting conversations. What we need, and that's why I mentioned the unlikely friendships. Yeah, we can have those outside of religious contexts. And sometimes some of the most inspiring hope I find is outside of those contexts. Let me tell you a story, though, that I think points toward the larger compelling story question. Brendan Cox was the guy, he was the husband of the woman, the British member of parliament who was killed several years ago by a Muslim. They thought at first it was a terrorist act. Then they discovered it was just a mentally ill person. But she was a rising minister of parliament for the Liberal Party in Britain, was killed, caused celebrity around the world. Brendan, her husband, with 2 young children, decided to start a project called More in Common. And it was designed to foster conversations between Christians and Muslims in England to say we have more in common than divides us and separates us. When I was doing some leadership development work with senior bishops in the Church of England, they asked me if I'd give up an hour of the 2 days I was going to spend with them for him to come and talk because they wanted an update. And I said, absolutely, I'd love to hear. And he got there and he said, More in Common is just really designed to get people talking about values in a generic sense. He says, we've discovered that there's a limit to this. And he said, here's what I want to share to you. I was just back from the US. This is about 3 years ago. He said, in the US, England, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, 5 Western countries, he said, I'm going to vastly oversimplify, but roughly we've got 25% who are secular cosmopolitans who are doing fine. They mostly live in the big cities on the coast. He said there's about 25% of these countries that are focused on hatred and bitterness. They're the neo-Nazis, they're the far right groups. And he says, and then 50% of the population, roughly, in each of these countries are what he called the anxious middle. He said there are people who have suffering, who feel isolated, who are worried about the future, worried about their families, worried about jobs. And he said, here's the problem. He said, the hate-filled people have a story. It's a divisive story, but it's one that can sound compelling. He said, the cosmopolitans, because they're content, don't actually have a story to tell. And then this is what Brendan Cox said to the bishops. He says, I'm a cosmopolitan and I'm part of the problem. And I've tried doing more in common from mostly just a secular frame. And it's not a very compelling story. He said, I don't believe any of the stuff you people believe. He said, I grew up in the Church of England. He said, but I gave it up when I became a young adult. And then he said, but you all have a story and you just haven't made it very compelling. And my question to you is, why not? And I just sat there and I thought, okay, I'm going to trash what I plan to do this afternoon with them, and we're going to process what he's just said. Yes, there are secular values that are really powerful, and Aristotle and Plato and lots of traditions that are completely secular have a lot to offer and to teach. What I worry is whether they're really compelling enough to navigate the complexities and the suffering. And for me, at least, in some complicated way, I find the most compelling story to be one that begins at Genesis 1 and ends at Revelation 22. And yet we're doing a horrible job too often living it and making it come alive. Greg Boyle, the guy I mentioned from Homeboy Industries, when he came and spent a week at Duke, and I interviewed him a number of times, if I had a dollar for every secular undergrad who said, oh, if that's what faith is, sign me up. Because it was lived and it was embodied, and he was in the prison saying mass, and he was working with kids who other people had abandoned. That seemed to me to be like Alyosha and the Brothers Karamazov.
I mean, I think being all products of late modernity, being reconvinced of the important and compelling nature of the transcendent after we've all been moved through the hermeneutics of suspicion as, in many ways, the very basis of how we conceptualize whether or not there is meaning. A reading group and I are looking at Ricoeur's understanding of hermeneutics of suspicion versus the hermeneutics of restoration of meaning or faith, right? And it feels like we have far more available to us now culturally. All the suspicion pieces, the cynicisms, the skepticisms, that is a natural part of how we come to any meaning-based claim. And we minimize it so quickly. And we don't have these deep aquifers anymore that you're speaking about, these transcending things, these deeper root systems, because it's very easy to show how each is built into power structures or any number of many things, right? And those are true things, those are real issues. But then we've come to deprive ourselves then of any capacity or willingness to go the distance with one of these deeper and compelling stories, in fear that we'll be duped, like the generations before. But then we are the anxious the middle, right? Where these politically melee's beings that don't know where to put themselves, and that unfortunately are becoming even more bifurcated and more radicalized at different ends of the spectrum. And so I mean, this is such a difficult moment for meaning.
Well, I would say, I think you made a really interesting point in what you were saying, because there are compelling stories that can seduce people for a period of time. The Nazis were one, the neo-Nazis, or Marie Le Pen in France, and Brexit in England, and they become compelling for a moment. They're actually superficially compelling. You talked about deeply compelling. And I think the kind of story that becomes deeply compelling is like Beloved, citing Romans, citing Hosea. I mean, just, if you're in the Jewish tradition and you're reading Hosea, you're kind of like, say what? This looks like a reversal of everything I expected. Or read through the Psalms, and you get a deeply compelling, powerful story because it touches every emotion. And what we have now are superficially compelling stories that are destructive, and they aren't deep and capable of that kind of richer resonance, which is what I think Ricoeur is pointing to. And what our great novelists do all the time is they take you where you're going, oh yeah, I got this. And then they take you on a detour and you go, oh, I didn't get that. That's what really becomes compelling. And that's what you learn, when you, in a friendship, if you take the time to sit and listen to another person's story, all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, over time, you're just going to go, oh, I had no idea all that is going into the kind of person you are. And when you say, I don't like X or I do love Y, there's a rich, complicated tapestry involved in that story. That doesn't mean I agree with you. Now I understand far more powerfully what's at stake. And education, too often, what do? We have people read a book and then critique it and point out what's wrong. The hardest thing I ever was asked to do in a class was to take a position I felt strongly about, research the opposing view, and write the best case I could for the view I disagreed with. That was hard. It didn't change my position ultimately, but it gave me a whole lot more sympathy for why people, in this case, it was capital punishment. I'm opposed to capital punishment. I've been all my life. I became deeply sympathetic to why people support it for very good moral reasons, ultimately still unpersuasive to me, but I'm much more sympathetic to the complexity than I was when I just thought anybody who disagreed with me was just wrong.
I two things really quick. I'm reading a very long biography of Abraham Lincoln. It's on my bucket list of things I always wanted to read, just a really robust biography of him. And I'm at the point in the book where it's describing his decision point about whether or not he would actually write the Emancipation Proclamation, which he did not want to do and had major struggles with and was quite undecided about for a while. And he was writing himself lots of notes, trying to wrap his mind around it. He writes a letter to a friend out in Illinois, asking his friend to come out to Washington, D.C. His friend, makes the month-long journey to sit with Lincoln, who then lays out all of the arguments for and against, everything he could think of, and then sends his friend away without even asking his friend's opinion. He just needed to work through it. And I guess his friend, when he got home to Illinois, says to his wife, yeah, he's not going to be doing the Emancipation Proclamation, because he made such a compelling case against why he should. But he tried it on. He struggled all the way through those truth claims and all that was fixed to it in order to get to the place of being able to make the most painful decision imaginable at that moment, because it brought about, all that we now know. But it was a huge risk move and ostracized quite a few people, but was the right thing. But he had to get there through that journey.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say earlier, when you were talking about the not the deep compelling truths, but these quick flash truths that can draw us. Also a product, I think, of this sort of late modern subject is we are also deprived of one another, being so individualized that I think we're starving. And I think we then are much more ravenous. I mean, when you think about when anyone's been deprived of food, you're not thinking about wanting to have a nice kale salad if it is available to you. I mean, you will do a burger and fries and pizza. Like, you will eat non-nourishing foods because you're ravenous and your body needs calories. And I think something similar can happen when it comes to pseudo meanings, right? These compelling but not deeply rooted narratives that we pick up and put on for a short while. I think we're so hungry that we eat that which is not nourishing to us.
I think that's exactly right. And we get seduced by the moral equivalent of junk food. It's dangerous, because it's like the difference between developing those rhythms and habits that we know actually bring us to life, which is friendship and those sorts of things. And instead we we look for quick fixes, and it becomes destructive of ourselves and of others. One other quick comment, just that you noted in the story about Lincoln, that he asked his friend to come to DC. And, it would be a lot to ask somebody like that now, but back then that didn't mean hop on a plane and be there in 2 hours. And yet, part of the character of friendship is that if you find out that a friend needs you, you don't start by saying, oh, will it fit in my schedule? How much will it cost? You say, of course I'll be there. Because part of it is your life is bound up with their life in a way that being present matters.
Mm-hmm. And the reverse, Lincoln knew that he wouldn't even have access to the fullness of his own mind and moral resolve and being without the presence of his friend.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's beautiful. I mean, it's the African notion of Ubuntu. I am who I am because you are who you are.
Yeah.
And you begin to reflect in that way. I mean, the power of when there's a deep friend and a death is you lose a portion of yourself, because it's not just that they're somebody you valued in a fundamental way. They're part of your brain, they're part of your soul, they're part of your life in that sense.
Yes. Well, it is time for us to start bringing this to a close. I think it would be wonderful if you have any final words that you'd want to leave us with. Please think for a moment about it. Let me say a quick expression of gratitude to some of our team here that's made it possible tonight, and it gives you a chance to collect your last thoughts. I want to thank Muki Manalili, who is the Psychology and the Other co-chair and does a lot of the bringing together of everything that you all just experienced tonight. And then also Darby McMakin and Hallie Creamer, our brilliant graduate assistants that are here in the background tonight, for all their work to bring this together and to help it run so smoothly. So thank you to the three of you. President Jones, any last words that you'd want to leave us with?
I would just say it's been a great joy and honor to be with you. I wish that we were connected physically and in an embodied way, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to connect via Zoom. And I would just conclude by the injunction, only connect. And one way to do that is to find somebody who you care about and who may need to hear about it in a surprising way, and say, I believe in you.
Thank you. Looking forward to breaking bread with you before too long.
Thanks.
Many blessings to everyone.
As well. Thanks so much. Great to be with you.
You
Good
too.
night.
Good night.